Hello, all you biologists. We are going to talk today about populations as part of our larger ecology discussion. Populations, of course, as you might recall, there we go, a population is a group of the same type of species living in a given area. So perhaps all the gray squirrels around Monacan High School or something like that could be a population, but it's a single species. Understanding what populations are doing is a really important part of understanding what our ecosystems are doing and understanding the health of our ecosystem. Is a particular population increasing in number, or is it decreasing in number? How will the rise or fall of a single population, perhaps of squirrels, impact other populations of other organisms in your ecosystem? Of all the ecological studies that occur, studies of populations are really important and probably what you may hear most about when you hear about ecology. So to talk about an example of how populations can be studied and how they affect each other. Sea otters in the Pacific Northwest, great example of population studies. They live in a kelp forest community, which we've briefly talked about, and they're super cute. In the kelp forest community of the Pacific Northwest, sea urchins, prickly fella over here, I don't know how anything can eat that, but sea otters can. Sea urchins are also predators upon kelp, okay? So sea urchins eat kelp and are eaten by sea otters. Now, due to hunting for their pelts, their fur coats, sea otters were eliminated almost or perhaps totally from the Pacific Northwest. When that happened, the sea urchin populations rose dramatically, and as a result, the kelp forests declined. So, when sea otters were declared in danger and protected from hunting, their populations were able to rebound, and they were able to start doing what they had always done before, and that was preying upon sea urchins. Okay? So a really important kind of window into what happens when we affect one organism that's not all we're affecting. Okay? All right. Another important thing to consider when we talk about population numbers, as we just saw with the otter and the sea urchin, predator-prey relationships. And we can see their relationship illustrated really, really clearly if we talk about this classic example of a hare and a lynx in a Canadian taiga type environment. Okay, a lynx is a type of bobcat-looking wild cat. So, as a hare population increases, okay, so we increase the number of our hares in this ecosystem. Okay. Lynx prey on the hares, and so since there's a lot of hares, the lynx population is able to be very vibrant and healthy and reproduce. There's lots of food for them, and so the lynx population goes up as well. So as our hare population increases, so does our lynx population increase. Okay? Now, but perhaps our lynx population increases just a little too much because they're doing so well and overpredates on the hares. So then the hare population begins to decline. Well, since the hare population starts to decline, then so does the lynx population begin to decline because obviously there's not as much there to eat any longer. Okay? Basically what we see is that in predator-prey relationships, they run together. The prey, as indicated by the blue line here, always has more, relatively speaking, organisms in the population than the predator, because you have to have, as we know from our trophic levels, you have to have more prey items to feed the predators because we're losing energy as we go up the food chain, but they do tend to run together, as you see clearly in this diagram. As the prey item goes up, the predator goes up, but that causes the prey item to come down in number, which causes the predator to come down in numbers. Okay? All right. Now, when we're studying populations, there are kind of, according to your textbook at least, 4 main characteristics of populations that we can study. First of all, where are they on the planet? What is their geographic distribution? Their range? How far can they go before it, gets too cold for them, perhaps? So the overall geographic area inhabited by a population. Okay? Density. How many of these individuals are in a given area? So if a population is very dense, we may have a lot of sea urchins, for example, in a given area of the kelp forest, or we may have a very low density population where there's not so many. Okay, so that's an important thing to consider. The growth rate of the population. Now, this is probably one of the primary things that we study when we study populations. Is what is the growth rate? Is the number of individuals increasing in our population or decreasing? And what are those numbers going to mean for the future of the ecosystem? Age structure. That looks at the ages of the organisms in your population and tells us a lot also about what the future might hold for the population. Will it increase or decrease in number? And we'll talk more about that later. So population growth, really important, hugely important aspect of populations. There are 3 factors that affect how big your population is. Okay, how many are getting born? You should know the term for that is natality. How many births you have? How many deaths, which is called mortality. Okay, and basically the number of individuals that enter or leave, and that would be immigration if you are coming in, emigration if you are exiting, if you are leaving the population. Okay, so births, deaths, who just happens to wander into your population and who happens to wander out. Okay, now there are reasons organisms might, well, obviously be born and die, but might enter and leave a population. For example, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide for what I was about to talk about. Organisms might enter and leave a population because some of the younger ones may mature and leave the area. If there's not enough food in the area, then organisms are going to leave, and so on. So there are reasons why you might get immigration and emigration in a population. Okay? So overall, I'm going back a slide, so hang on if you're taking notes. Population will increase or decrease in size, obviously, depending on how many individuals are added or removed from it. And of course, we are going to see population growth if more individuals are born than die, if more move in than leave, okay? And if births and deaths and immigration and emigration are equal, then our population is probably going to remain quite stable, okay? All right. Now, there is an equation. We will use this equation in a lab, but that can give us a growth rate per unit time. How many critters per year are we adding or subtracting from this population? Please remember, growth rate, we call it growth rate, but it may also tell us a decline as well. Be aware of the symbols: births, deaths, immigrants, emigrants, and we arrange it just like this: natality minus mortality, immigration minus emigration. Then we add those two together, divide by time, and that gives us our growth rate. That is the shorthand, and that's what you can write in your little notes section if you wish. All right, there are a couple of really types of typical and important types of population growth. One of them is exponential growth, okay? If individuals in a population reproduce at a constant rate, okay, initially the growth of the population is slow. We have, one guy, and maybe he makes, if it's a bacterium, he might make two are going to divide and make 4, and so on. But as the number in the population gets larger and larger, all of a sudden the reproduction is going to, every time they reproduce, you're going to create many, many, many more offspring, okay? So essentially what an exponential growth curve then looks like is you begin with very slow growth, but then, whoa, it really takes off, okay? 8 becomes 16, 16 becomes 32, 32 becomes 64, 64 becomes 128, and so on. And as the numbers get bigger, the growth really just takes off. What's required for exponential growth is simply great conditions, great ideal conditions, unlimited resources, if this is going to continue on up, unlimited resources. Now, how many environments have unlimited resources? Not too many. So here's an example, population growth and bacteria. Think about that. These organisms have the fastest rates of reproduction among all living things. 20 minutes for any population of bacteria to double. So why haven't they just taken over the earth? Why can we even move around on the planet without having to swim through bacteria? Okay? Well, the reason is because they don't have unlimited resources. When organisms have to compete for resources, then all of a sudden the numbers of them are held in check. Okay? So this brings us to our discussion of logistic growth. Okay? Logistic growth is a growth pattern that occurs when a population's growth either slows down or its growth rate just stops after some period of going really fast, exponential growth. Okay? Things that slow a population's growth would be running out of food, getting eaten by predators, diseases, and even natural disasters can limit growth. Okay? Now, a logistic growth curve looks almost just like an exponential one. You start, as we see here, this is time, and this is numbers of organisms. Okay? And we start slow, and then we start to take off, and the population is going up, 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 up. Then something happens. Maybe we start to run out of food or whatever, and we just can't support anymore. We can support this level of bacteria, this number of, or bunnies or whatever we're talking about in the population, but we just can't support any more than that, okay? The growth level levels off, and we have hit something called carrying capacity. Its symbol is K, as you see right there. It says dotted line, but that one's not exactly dotted, but carrying capacity is simply the maximum number of individuals that a particular environment can support. Okay? Maybe it's 50 rabbits out here in Smoke Tree or something. I don't know what the carrying capacity is, but that, and above the carrying capacity, we just can't get population to sustain itself. Okay? So that's really important, and this is where we are talking where a bacterial population would be, for example, why they don't just keep going up and up and up and up. They hit carrying capacity for their environment. Okay, so whenever birth and death rates are the same, population growth is going to level out. Please be aware that even when a population technically stops increasing in number, it's not doing this anymore, it is not just perfectly level. It will oscillate around carrying capacity. So it might look actually a little more like that hare and lynx graph, right around carrying capacity. The populations will just kind of hang out there. They might go up and down a little, but in general, they'll hover around carrying capacity. Okay? Now, let's talk a little bit more about things that actually limit growth. These are called limiting factors in general. So, competition for resources, for food, for shelter, for water, whatever, that is going to limit the size your population can attain. Predation, as we've seen, will limit population growth as well. Parasitism, disease, okay, droughts, or other environmental factors, human disturbances. If we come and plow down the forest, that's definitely going to limit some population growth in that forest. Okay, so all of those things are limiting factors. Now, there are two types of limiting factors, two categories of limiting factors that limit population growth. One type is called density dependent, and one type is called density independent. Okay, so let's talk about this. Remember what density is. Density is how many critters do you have in a given area. One of these limiting factors, this plays a big role, and in the other limiting factor, this does not play a big role. Okay? So, the size of the population is a big factor in density-dependent limiting factors, okay? For example, they usually have the greatest impact, this type of limiting factor, when the population is really large and dense. So here is an area. Here is about a zillion squirrels in the area. Now, they are all competing for acorns. So the more squirrels you get, the more the number of acorns present is going to limit them. They're not going to be able to just keep having squirrels and making more squirrels and more squirrels. Eventually, they're going to run out of food. Acorns might be the limiting factor, and it's even more limiting the more critters you have. Okay? So, things that are density-dependent limiting factors are things you compete for, like, as we already said, food and shelter, okay? But also diseases or parasites that are transmitted like diseases, because the more critters you have in this area, the easier it is for them to pass disease. If you live way out in the country and there's only like 2 of you and over a 30-mile radius, you're not likely to pass diseases back and forth, okay? So this factor of disease would get even more be more limiting the more critters you had in the area. It would have more of an effect, okay? Density independent limiting factors, however, it really doesn't matter how many organisms you have. For example, if you go down and you mow down the forest, then pretty much, I don't care if there's only 2 of you in the forest or 102 of you, you're all going to die. You're not going to be able to continue to grow your population. Weather events, a hurricane, a tornado, as is in the picture. If it comes and plows down the forest, then, you know, it really doesn't matter how many of you were there. You are all going to be limited because that tornado came through. Okay? Now, let's talk about our population, human population growth, okay? Of course, just like any other population of living things, human being populations tend to increase with time, and the human population growth curve looks very much like a growth curve we've seen already. It was initially slow because food was scarce, life was really harsh, it's hard to survive. But then something interesting happened about 500 years ago, okay? We got more rapid growth, okay? In fact, it became exponential. Let's just look at the growth curve real quick, and we'll come back to that slide. Slow growth for a lot of years. Then we hit this point in time about 500-ish years ago, and you see this zoom up. Till today we have about 7 billion more or less on the planet, okay? What caused the big zoom up? What caused the big zoom up was major improvements in what we were able to do as humans. Agriculture and industrial type advances. Agriculture, learning to farm, increased our food supply, and the fact that the food supply became very reliable, improved sanitation, stopping the spread of disease, medicines, of course. So our population went up in response to those ways that we were able to finally control our environment, okay? Demography is the term for the study of human populations and tries to predict how they may change in the course of time. Okay. Demographic transition is a term that's kind of interesting to talk about. Population growth in some countries around the world has slowed down. For example, in the United States, population growth is pretty slow. Japan, and even in much of Europe. Okay. Question is, why? The hypothesis is that these countries have completed what is called the demographic transition. Now, here is what the demographic transition is. A dramatic change in birth and death rates that happens when, imagine this country or any country. Initially, the birth and death rates are both quite high. Poor medical care, poor resources, and so on. So lots of babies get born, but a lot of people die, and a lot of the children die, okay? But advances in nutrition, okay, lower that death rate. So if you have advances in nutrition and lower the death rate, but you're still having lots of babies, then your population is going to increase very rapidly. Now, as society modernizes, increases education, and so on, families start to have fewer children. Birth control becomes more popular. People have fewer children, wait to have children. They want to finish their education and so on. So now the birth rate begins to fall to meet the death rate. And so when births equal deaths, the population growth is stable and the growth stops. Now, many countries have not completed that transition yet. Most countries, if you look here, well, I won't, most might be extreme, but in the red and the orange, here are countries that have not completed the transition, but are in the early stages of it, or have not. Like, for example, the light color are about midway through the process. The red color either haven't started it or are in the early stages of transition, and the yellows have completed this demographic transition, okay? So most countries have not really completed the transition. India is a great example. China, these are huge, huge populated countries, and they are still growing, okay? All right, age structure diagrams show how many people of different ages and genders are in a population, and this, again, is a tool to help predict future population growth, okay? The ages here, the youth are down here, middle-aged and old, same over here. But what we see here is that we have lots and lots of kids in this population, very few old people. Well, all these kids are going to grow up and have babies, and so this is going to get even wider as time goes on, this youthful base. This is a rapid growth situation with the age structure diagram has a very wide base. When the base is narrow, you don't have as many youth. That means you won't have as many offspring being born, and so the growth is slow. If your pyramid was inverted like this, your population would be actually in decline, okay? All right. So factors to consider: the age structure of each country, how many life-threatening diseases are prevalent in the country. All of those things help predict future population growths. Predictions for 2050, according to your textbook, were 9 billion people on Earth. We've hit 7 billion within the fairly recent year or two, okay? Some scientists suggest that if the human population growth rate does not slow down, we are going to damage the environment beyond repair, and of course damage our economy if we damage our environment to that degree. Of course, some economists say that technological advances and changes in society can mitigate these negative impacts. That all of that is open to a lot of interpretation by you. So we'll talk about that a little in class. All right. Thanks for watching. I will see you in class and in the next podcast. Take care.